7012 is the first service bulletin we see on the 400. It was basically removing the little metal plates they put underneath the screws, which allowed the switch box to short out a lot more easily. So they had you take those off, and then that was the first thing. And then they wanted you to move the orange shorting wires right here, so they weren't short out on the case. $7015. Again, they had you move some more wires in hopes that things would work better. Reroute the two charging wires from the stator and get them up in a position where you could see on the picture. So that was the next improvement. Next, we had the Merc 400 improvement program. 8 steps, basically. Go do the things that you did in the beginning. A new distributor and body. Those are the two pieces, what I call a distributor cap and a rotor. And then you had new ignition stator, probably so it wouldn't short out internally. I really don't know what the problem was with it, but I do remember doing some. And again, do the square steel washer if they weren't already done. A vent tube restrictor. I think it was basically a piece of foam you put inside of the tube. And a new ignition lead, terminal covers. The improvement program went on for just one page. And then 7110, we had a new Merc improvement program. Basically, we had to change the rotor. It was a different type. It had a different identifier, ignition stator, square steel washers, vent tube, ignition lead, terminal covers, retest and make all adjustments, and then telling you how to hook up the switch box. Now we got page 2, rough operation, cut out at low speeds, misfires, and all the allowances. That's changed 3 right here, and so that was a three-pager. Merc 400 intake ports were just 2 of the 6 on the 115 in 1970-71, and one of the 80 pistons, same pistons as the 115 and the 80, and the same banjo reed intake system, and the same top bearing, and the bottom bearing was the same. It had a single row bearing on the bottom, same part number, and a double row on top. So it's very, very similar. I mean, that's what they were trying to duplicate. And the problems came when distribution of the spark on this engine, I think, was its biggest problem. How do we distribute the spark? And on the 6-cylinder and the 4-cylinder, the pass plate did the job on the capacitive discharge ignition. So they had to do this one a little bit differently. Basically, this was an alternator driven because it was a manual start engine. So how do we do it? And I think their approach was a good one, but it didn't work. Again, we've got this distributor, and you can see what kind of condition it's in inside. They changed it 2 or 3 times. It's been arcing all the way around. And then the rotor, which fit down over the crankshaft, had a flat in it. You can see the flat, and a flat on the crankshaft. And again, you can look at this. You can see burning all the way well past the metal distribution. a very simple solution would have been a double firing coil and had waste fire. But you know, those sometimes the simple answers don't come easy. So I mean, they were all thinking single coil. This had a single coil right here. Here it is. And that single coil is, you know, it works, but not well in this particular case. On an aside, this was also starting to be a big problem. The alcohol and the fuel we first saw in '74. Jimmy Carter was president, and the alcohol would attack the metal casing bond. These are the bottom end cap seals. Usually were doubled up in the bottom. In this particular case, they were actually inside of the crankcase, but they still were doubled up. Still the same two seals that they used in the 80 and the 115, and they peeled. That's why on these engines, these older engines, you've always got to pay attention to these bottom end cap seals, because on these engines, these later engines in '70, they'd agreed to take the fuel that puddles down here and pull it back up to the top and distribute it. And they did that on the 2s, the 4s, and the 6s. And typically the water and alcohol would collect down here and get distributed through the whole engine. And then when it sat over the wintertime, it would rust up the journals on here. And the ball bearing, usually not on top, usually the ball bearing on the bottom, this one right here, would get hit. And they're usually bad. And it's a real good idea anytime you're working on these engines to make sure that those two, that the bottom ball bearing and the seals are addressed, and that you winterize the engine with a paraffin base storage seal. Mercury calls it. Johnson Evinrude used a different one, but it's probably made by the same company, same stuff. Paraffin base, which displaces water rather than trapping it. Merc 400. Notice the 3 bolts. They hold the bottom bearing in. And this is a new setup. The lower unit in the 400 was spiral bevel gears, which were quieter, but it had the short housing like the 350. In other words, the clearance between here and here wasn't much. In '73, the 402 had a much larger distance between here and here, so it would swing a bigger propeller. It had the old reverse lock cam, brass. These are brass piece right here. There's a corresponding piece that pushes up a tongue inside of the midsection. And the studs were close together on this one. Same as the 350. And then here's the push pin that they used instead of a roller bearing here at the top of the drive shaft. Sat down below the water pump housing, the lower water pump housing. They used a tapered roller bearing. Apparently a little more efficient, but it needed to have a preload pin in order to keep it from jumping out. So to keep it in the tapered roller bearing in its race. These had a very unfortunate problem in salt water. If you didn't grease these splines just about every year, they would freeze up and you'd have a solid crankshaft, drive shaft situation. Merc 400 had a push pin because they were using spiral bevel gears to make it quieter. As I say, this came out a little bit earlier with the last iteration of the 350. But one of the problems was that in the very early 70s, when this came out, the EPA, or whatever the hell the agency was at that time, required the engines to no longer have any overboard dump. We had some real bad ones like the Fat 50, Johnson Evinrude in 58, that pumped over 55% unburned fuel overboard before it even got to the combustion chamber. Mercury's they were in the 7%, most of them. There was one bad one, was the 800, but this particular model, very little. But the splines had always been lubricated by that lost oil coming out of the bottom end cap, and now they had to recirculate it. So water could get up in there. They first tried the O-ring, which you can see the groove here. There's no O-ring there, but at this point, because it fell out. But it wasn't a very successful system. Plus, with this pin arrangement, you had the shaft moving up and down, and they were steel. And when they moved up and down, for some reason, they got seal cut. You can see seal cut right here. They got seal cut down in the water pump base, and they leaked quite fast, especially if they were in salt water like this one. So we'll take a look and see how bad this one is. Here's the drive shaft on the 400. And if you can look, that's where the bottom seal rides right there, and this is where the top seal rides, and they're both very badly rusted and seal cut. That's because the shaft jumps up and down, and the old straight bearing, instead of a tapered bearing like this, they didn't have to have this pin to hold it in. And when the engine's running fast, the pinion gear wants to ride away from the forward gear. It wants to jump away from it, and that's when that pin, that's what its job is, to hold this thing down, the bearing, into its seat. And it does jump some, and these things rusted like hell. And there's two solutions. You replace the drive shaft with the new one, which is stainless steel, at least inserted here is stainless, and some of them the whole shaft is, except for the bottom end. Or you can put a speedy sleeve. And typically, speedy sleeve on this one would be okay, because the keyway for the water pump key is not worn around the sides like it is on some of them. You can see where it's ridden around, especially if it had a single bearing instead of having the flat key. Those, when they're gone, then you've got to replace the shaft when it wears along the sides and the back, and it'll no longer hold a water pump. So these are some of the things you want to check for when you're looking at these things. You want to pull that bottom water pump and check that out, and make sure that it isn't seal cut. And if you do replace it, and they are good, you want to make sure you put plenty of good grease on it. Typically, I like Mercury's 24C. It's not. It doesn't have any ability to corrode stuff or turn into salt mush like some of the early ones, like multi-purpose lubricant did. If you look in this bottom water pump housing, you can see that there are two seals. There's one seal here and then one down inside, which is pretty rusty looking. And if you pack it with grease 2,4-C in between the two, that does provide good lubrication and good sealing, and it will prevent the kind of damage we see here, where it's seal cut. But eventually it's going to happen. Salt water, real poison for these things. Mercury really didn't get their act together much on salt water until '75, when they started putting a stainless steel piece in here. But that's it for this lower unit. It is kind of an unusual. Later on, when they came out with the 402, they no longer had this arrangement here. They had that plastic locking cam that came underneath. The reverse locks went down over the pin by themselves when you drop the engine down. Frosty begging like a Labrador for any food he can get his hands on.